Hi, folks, and welcome to the DaveCast for Tuesday, October 6th. It's a new week as we continue in the study of James. Last Thursday, we left off at chapter 1, verse 18, where James has been talking about trials and temptations. And so let's go ahead and pick it up in verse 19 as we continue our study today. James writes, "You must understand this, my beloved. Let everyone be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger, for your anger does not produce God's righteousness." And so that's a pretty famous saying, right? I mean, be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger. You've heard that before. Everybody's heard that before. And I would even go so far as to say that there are probably a lot of people who have heard that and don't even know it's from the Bible. I mean, they might have thought it was from Poor Richard's Almanac or something like that. And if people do know it's from the Bible, they might not even know where it's from, what chapter it's in, or what the context is, because it's such good, universal, timeless advice, right? I mean, we would all do well to abide by that saying, be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger. Those are great words to live by. But here's the thing. The text is written to a particular group of people. And I do think that context makes it just all the more meaningful and helps us understand and apply it more deeply to our lives in the here and now. And so let's think about it for a moment. What was it that would have made James' readers angry? Why did James' readers need to hear, be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger? And listen, I know I keep mentioning this, but I do think it's so important to remember who the audience was for this letter. They were Jewish Christians that were living in dispersion, who had to flee their homes due to persecution in Jerusalem. And of course, the persecution was unjust and wrong, and they had all suffered for it. And you can read about it in Acts chapter 8. We did that one time. But they were drugged from their houses and thrown into prison. Some were beaten. And so the rest pretty much fled for their lives. And so they were now living in dispersion. You might have heard it called diaspora before. There are several diasporas of Jewish people, and this is just one of them. But now they were in the process of rebuilding their lives, and they missed their home, and they missed their extended family, they missed their old way of life. I mean, it was hard times. They were starting over when they should have been getting ahead. And so now the initial shock of what they had been through was wearing off, and anger was setting in. It's understandable that they'd be angry, right? Some might even call it a righteous anger. You know, just think of the injustices that they have been through. And yet, and this is so very important, James still gives us advice. He still says, be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. You know, I think too often we assume that anger with a righteous cause is righteous anger. But if that were true, James wouldn't have needed to write this passage. And so what is James trying to get his readers to understand and do? And I believe that what James is trying to get them to see is if they allowed their anger to get the best of them and they begin to live with this underlying attitude of anger and bitterness, that their Christian witness would have been compromised, that their anger would not accomplish God's righteousness, as James says there in verse 20. I mean, have you ever known anyone whose kind of baseline personality was one of anger and bitterness, and how that affects all they do, you know, how they view the world? It enters into every conversation and relationship that they just about have, and they sort of live with this victim mentality. And so as hard as it was going to be, these dispersed Christians, they must listen to their new neighbors and resist the urge to quickly interject whenever they felt threatened or fear, which was understandable given all that they had been through, and they'd already been run out of one town because of their faith. I mean, you would think it'd be kind of normal for them to have this sort of PSTD about all it and maybe treat outsiders with hostility and suspicions. But James is trying to teach them that if they were argumentative and defensive, then relationships with their new neighbors would have been closed off before they had a chance to open. and they would not have had a chance to share the gospel. If they were going to live as Christ's disciples, that their joy had to come from another place. We saw last week in James 14, consider it all joy when you go through various trials. And so James is urging his readers to obey this passage by not allowing their anger and bitterness to spill over into their relationships. And then he continues in verse 20, therefore put away all filthiness and rampant wickedness that is so prevalent, and humbly accept the word planted in you that can save you. And so here James is giving intensely practical instruction about what we must do in order to be able to receive the word. I mean, we have some negative work to do. We have to do some demolition before we can do construction, right? You have to weed the garden or plow up the field before you can plant the seed. And so that's the idea here. The actual metaphor that James uses is that of putting away. The word there carries the ideas of stripping off garments. It's the same kind of language that Paul uses in all of his famous put off and put on passages. Those passages like in Ephesians 4 where Paul says, put off your old nature and put on the new nature created in the likeness of God. Or I always love the ones about, clothing yourself with something, clothing yourself with righteousness or compassion. Or like in Colossians, it says, clothe yourselves with love. And so, James actually doesn't talk about putting on. He drops that part of the metaphor. But I think he's making it very clear. It's putting away, it's taking off, it's stripping away the soiled garments. And of course, what James has in mind here are qualities of our life that are sinful, particularly anger. He says, put away all filthiness and rampant wickedness. So let me talk about those two things. First of all, the language James usually probably is best translated like something like the excesses of evil or the remains of evil. That word wickedness here is the same word for malice. He especially has that in mind. Malice in the heart, ill will, evil intentions from the heart that comes very much from a place of anger. When we get anger towards someone, we have malice toward them and we'll vilify them, right? And he also says to put away filthiness. And so what does that mean? Well, one of the commentaries that I've been using to prepare for this study is by a guy named Thomas Manton. And he points out that there are three things in Scripture that were called filthy. Three things that were called filthy in Scripture. And I didn't check it myself. I'm not taking his word for it. But he said that the three things that are called filthy in Scripture, the first one is covetousness. And so that makes me think of the verse in the old King James language where it talks about filthy lucre. Lucre, of course, means money. And so that's actually how our modern translations translate it. So the idea here is a love of money that is defiling. The love of money is filthy. And that's pretty convicting because we kind of been programmed to think of money as this great luxurious thing, not something that is filthy. But it's the idea of the love of money that's filthy. And so that's the first one. And the second thing the Scripture calls filthy is lust, moral impurity. And I think that's pretty obvious. And at least for me, that's much easier to wrap my mind about because I can't think of anything that's more filthy or slimy than like an adult bookstore off somewhere. And then Manton says in his commentary that the third thing that Scripture calls filthy is anger. It's anger. It's a heart that is contaminated by anger. It's a heart made filthy by anger. And it certainly seems, given this context, that this is what James has in mind. In essence, what James is saying here is take off that filthy garment. Take off that filthy coat of anger so that the seed of the word may bloom within you, which is kind of a mixed metaphor, but I think we all get the point, And so with that in mind, as we get, now towards the end of the lesson, let's talk for a second about applying all of this to our lives living here in 2020. Because this is a year when a lot of people, I'll say a lot of us, I'll throw myself in the mix because I feel it too sometimes, we are living just below the boiling point. You know what I mean? I think that the pressures and uncertainty around the pandemic, coupled with all the rest of the stresses of this year, and especially now the sharp, painful divide we have in politics, people are just going around right below the boiling point, and it doesn't take very much at all for them to react in anger. And so then what would it look like for us to live, the way that James is suggesting? How do we make this practical applications to it in our everyday lives? And for me, I find myself returning to this phrase, seek first to understand, then to be understood. Seek first to understand, then to be understood. I think about that all the time. I think the way that I'm phrasing it there comes from like the 7 habits of highly effective people, but it's very much in line with the prayer of St. Francis of Assisi, where he says, "O divine master, grant that I might not so much seek to be understood than to understand." And so this verse that we've been looking at from James, to be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, it's all the same thing. And so in this turbulence that has struck our nation and really spreads throughout the globe, I see a lot of people talking and a lot of times actually shouting without much listening, without the intent to understand. I think that was particularly on display last week, in the presidential debate. It's one of the most painful, awful things I've ever watched in my life. It was shouting at each other, and most of the time shouting at the same time and name-calling, and accomplished nothing except dividing our country further. And my fear is that it's modeling for all of us, and especially our young people, a kind of behavior and a kind of way of relating to one another that is just so toxic. It's filthy. We can disagree, but we can do it with some kind of civility that listens and shows empathy and affords dignity to one another. But in our world today, each side seems only interested in making their point, and the record needle seems to be getting stuck in the same groove over and over, and it's just causing more and more stress and more division and more anger. To solve our problems, we're going to need to start listening rather than waiting for the other person to quit shouting long enough for us to shout back. Or in the case of the presidential debate, just shouting over each other. Think about this. It takes practice to learn how to listen with empathy. And it takes time to seek first to understand, then to be understood. It really does. It takes time to do that. But it takes far more time to correct the misunderstandings and to live with the unresolved problems that we have in our day. And so, we may not be seeing it in our political leaders, but as Christians, we are called to do better. We are actually commanded to love others. Our love should model the love that God demonstrated to us and not 1 ounce less. We, as followers of Jesus, should speak truth and be beacons of hope that can calm the storms other people are facing and cool down this temperature of right under the boiling point of anger that's so dominant in our culture today. And I know this all sounds idealistic or Pollyannish or like I'm viewing the world through rose-colored glasses. But listen, I want a better world, don't you? I want a kinder world, a more empathetic world, a more forgiving world. And so I refuse to give into a worldview that just says this is just the way it is. Because we can make a difference. We can change the world. And so, friends, amid the growing unrest we live in, we need to be voices of faith and vessels of peace. Remember, we can make a difference. But we can't do it sitting on the sidelines hoping it's just all going to go away. We can't do it by saying one thing in church, in our church lives, and then turning around and reacting with anger and division in every other part of our lives. We've got to commit ourselves to live this way in all our relationships and not give in to division and anger. And by God's grace, May it be so. Well, that's it for this Tuesday. I'll be back with you on Thursday. But until then, be safe, keep bringing the hope, and I'll see you then. God bless.